Native American civilizations before European contact. North America was home to diverse and complex Native American civilizations long before European explorers set foot on the continent. These societies varied greatly in culture, language, social organization, and technology, reflecting thousands of years of adaptation to a vast range of environments, from the Arctic tundra to the deserts of the Southwest. One of the earliest known cultures in North America is the Paleo-Indians, who arrived around 12,000 years ago during the last ice age. They were primarily hunter-gatherers, known for crafting distinctive fluted projectile points used in hunting large ice age mammals such as mammoths and mastodons. As the climate warmed and these large mammals went extinct, native peoples adapted by diversifying their diets and developing new technologies. By around 3000 BCE, various cultures began practicing agriculture, cultivating staples such as maize, corn, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, which became fundamental to many Native American diets. The development of agriculture led to more permanent settlements and complex societies. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, formerly known as Anasazi, developed impressive stone and adobe dwellings, including the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and the Great Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. They had intricate irrigation systems to support their agriculture and produced elaborate pottery and textiles. The Mississippian culture, flourishing between roughly 800 CE and 1600 CE in the Mississippi River Valley, built large earthen mounds used for religious and political purposes. Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, was the largest urban center north of Mexico during this period, home to tens of thousands of inhabitants. This culture was characterized by complex chiefdoms, trade networks extending across North America, and a rich ceremonial life. In the Northeast, the Iroquois Confederacy united several tribes such as the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. They developed sophisticated political systems, including representative councils, which some scholars argue influenced the development of American democratic principles. The Pacific Northwest cultures thrived on abundant natural resources, with societies known for totem poles, potlatch ceremonies, and plank houses. Their economies relied heavily on fishing, especially salmon, and they developed complex social hierarchies. Social structures varied widely, from hunter-gatherer bands to complex, stratified chiefdoms. Spiritual beliefs were often closely tied to nature and ancestral spirits, expressed through art, storytelling, and rituals. The arrival of Europeans would profoundly disrupt these societies through disease, warfare, and displacement. But before that, Native American civilizations exhibited remarkable diversity and sophistication across the continent. Early Spanish expeditions and settlements. When we think of early European encounters with North America, Spain's voyages are often the first to come to mind. The story begins in 1492, when Christopher Columbus, sailing under the Spanish crown of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, landed in the Caribbean, believing he had found a new route to Asia. This moment, though not a direct arrival on the North American mainland, set the stage for decades of Spanish exploration and colonization across the Americas. Following Columbus's voyages, Spain aggressively pursued claims throughout the New World. The Spanish were driven by a mix of motives: the thirst for gold and wealth, the desire to expand their empire, and the fervent wish to spread Christianity. These ambitions led to some of the most dramatic and transformative encounters in American history. One of the most famous Spanish expeditions was led by Hernán Cortés in 1519. Landing on the coast of present-day Mexico, Cortés marched inland and encountered the powerful Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, centered around the magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, were one of the most advanced civilizations of the time, known for their elaborate temples, complex social structure, and rich cultural traditions. Yet, despite their strength, the Aztecs were ultimately overwhelmed by a combination of Spanish military technology, strategic alliances with rival tribes, and devastating diseases like smallpox that Europeans inadvertently brought with them. Cortés's conquest culminated in 1521 with the fall of Tenochtitlan. This event marked a significant shift in power, opening vast territories in Central America to Spanish control. The wealth extracted from these lands, particularly gold and silver, fueled Spain's status as a dominant European power for centuries. Meanwhile, to the south in the Andes Mountains, Francisco Pizarro was mounting a similar expedition. In 1532, Pizarro met the Inca Empire, the largest empire in pre-Columbian America. The Incas were remarkable for their engineering feats, including an extensive network of roads and impressive cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu. Despite their sophistication, the Incas fell quickly to Pizarro's forces, again aided by superior weaponry and the tragic effects of disease. The Spanish crown moved quickly to consolidate its new territories by establishing settlements, forts, and missions. These missions were religious outposts run by Catholic priests, who aimed to convert the indigenous populations to Christianity. The Spanish missions spread throughout the southwest United States, California, and Mexico, becoming centers of religion, culture, and economic activity. The Spanish also introduced European farming techniques, livestock such as horses, cattle, and sheep, and new crops to the Americas. This exchange was part of a larger process historians call the Columbian Exchange, where plants, animals, and ideas were exchanged between the Old and New Worlds. However, the impact on Native American societies was far from positive. Alongside new technology and trade goods came destruction. Native populations suffered immense losses due to forced labor systems like the encomienda, warfare, and diseases to which they had no immunity. Spain's early settlements were not just military outposts but complex societies where cultures collided, merged, and clashed. The mestizo population, people of mixed indigenous and European descent, began to grow, forming a unique cultural group that still shapes Latin America today. In Florida, the Spanish established St. Augustine in 1565, which remains the oldest continuously inhabited European established settlement in the continental United States. It served as a military base and a hub for Spanish activity along the Atlantic coast, competing with French and English interests. The Spanish Empire's reach in North America was vast but faced constant challenges, from resisting native uprisings, managing distant territories, and competing with other European powers like France and England. Yet, their early expeditions laid the foundation for centuries of European influence on the continent, leaving behind a legacy of language, religion, architecture, and cultural blending that endures. The French and Dutch presence in North America. As Spain solidified its power in much of Central and South America, other European nations, most notably France and the Netherlands, were beginning to stake their claims in North America. While Spain's ambitions were fueled largely by the pursuit of gold and the spread of Catholicism, the French and Dutch approaches combined commerce, exploration, and a more cooperative relationship with Native American peoples. French exploration and settlement. The French crown was motivated by both economic interests and a desire to expand its influence in the New World. The story of French North America begins in earnest with explorers like Jacques Cartier, who in the 1530s navigated the St. Lawrence River and claimed vast areas for France. However, it was Samuel de Champlain, often called the father of New France, who laid the groundwork for lasting French presence with the founding of Quebec City in 1608. Quebec was established not just as a settlement, but as a strategic trading post, especially for the fur trade. The dense forests and vast waterways of the region were home to beavers and other fur-bearing animals whose pelts were highly prized in Europe. French traders and trappers, often called voyageurs, developed extensive networks with Native American tribes, trading European goods such as metal tools, firearms, and cloth for furs. Unlike the often hostile relationships seen between other European settlers and indigenous populations, French explorers and settlers frequently formed alliances and partnerships. They learned native languages, adopted some indigenous customs, and intermarried with local tribes. These relationships were not merely peaceful, they were practical, as the French relied on Native Americans' knowledge of the land and support in territorial conflicts, particularly against the English. The French also established missions to spread Catholicism, but these missions operated alongside the fur trade economy rather than overpowering it. Jesuit missionaries traveled with fur traders and worked to convert indigenous peoples, but often showed more cultural sensitivity than their Spanish counterparts. The French expanded their territory along the Mississippi River, reaching as far south as Louisiana. This vast network of waterways connected various French settlements, enabling trade and communication over great distances. Dutch colonization and New Netherland. At the same time, the Dutch were carving out their own foothold in North America, motivated primarily by commerce and trade. The Dutch East India Company was one of the most powerful trading entities of its time, and the Dutch sought to establish colonies that would complement their global trade network. In 1609, Henry Hudson, sailing under the Dutch flag, explored the river that now bears his name, opening the way for Dutch claims in the region. By 1624, the Dutch had established the colony of New Netherland, centered around the port of New Amsterdam on the southern tip of Manhattan Island. New Amsterdam quickly became a bustling trading hub, attracting people from various backgrounds and cultures due to the Dutch policy of religious tolerance and pragmatism. Merchants, artisans, and settlers of different faiths found a place in this vibrant colony. The Dutch emphasis on commerce and trade shaped New Netherlands' development as a commercial center rather than a strictly agricultural or religious settlement. Dutch settlers also engaged in fur trading, following the French model in many ways. They traded extensively with Native American tribes, forming alliances and sometimes conflicts over land and resources. The Dutch West India Company controlled much of the colony's trade and maintained a network of forts and trading posts along the Hudson River. However, the Dutch hold on New Netherland was relatively short-lived. In 1664, the English seized the colony without much resistance and renamed it New York, after the Duke of York. Despite the change in control, the Dutch cultural and architectural influences remained embedded in the city for years to come. Impact and legacy. The French and Dutch presence in North America had lasting impacts, both in terms of geography and culture. French influence persists today in Quebec and other parts of Canada, where French is still an official language, and in Louisiana, where French culture shaped the region's unique Creole identity. The Dutch legacy is most visible in New York City, whose diverse population and commercial spirit reflect its multicultural origins. Street names, place names, and architecture bear the mark of Dutch heritage. Both nations demonstrated different colonial models compared to the English and Spanish. Their willingness to engage in trade partnerships and relatively cooperative relations with Native Americans allowed them to build networks that endured despite European rivalries. As the 17th century progressed, these European powers competed for control, resources, and influence in North America. The dynamics they set in motion, alliances, conflicts, and cultural blending, would shape the continent's development for centuries. English colonization, Jamestown, Virginia. Imagine stepping into the year 1607, a time when the New World was still a vast, mysterious land of opportunity, danger, and dreams. The English crown, eager to expand its influence and reap the riches of the Americas, sent a group of settlers to establish the first permanent English colony on this wild continent. Their destination was Jamestown, Virginia, a place that would come to symbolize both the struggles and successes of early English colonization. The story of Jamestown begins with the Virginia Company of London, a joint stock company that pooled resources from wealthy investors in England. They hoped to find gold, silver, and a new trade route to Asia, much like Spain had done in the south. On April 26, 1607, about 104 settlers arrived aboard 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, landing on a marshy peninsula along the James River. The location itself was challenging. The site was swampy, full of mosquitoes carrying diseases like malaria. Fresh water was scarce, and the settlers faced an unfamiliar climate and terrain. To make matters worse, the colonists included a mix of gentlemen unaccustomed to hard labor, craftsmen, and a handful of soldiers, not the ideal combination for survival in such harsh conditions. From the start, Jamestown settlers encountered tensions with the local Native American tribe, the Powhatan Confederacy, led by Chief Powhatan. The two groups oscillated between uneasy trade, cautious peace, and open conflict. The Native Americans were initially wary of these strange newcomers who disrupted their lands and resources. The early years of Jamestown were marked by hardship and near disaster. The infamous starving time during the winter of 1609 to 1610 nearly wiped out the entire colony. Food shortages, disease, and internal strife took a devastating toll. Only about 60 of the original 500 colonists survived. Desperation led some to extreme measures, including documented cases of cannibalism. But Jamestown did not die. The colony was saved by a mix of strong leadership, strategic alliances, and sheer determination. Captain John Smith, a bold and resourceful leader, famously took charge in 1608, establishing the rule that he who does not work shall not eat. His efforts to organize the settlers and maintain relationships with the Powhatan were crucial to survival. A particularly dramatic moment was Smith's capture by Powhatan's warriors, after which, according to legend, Chief Powhatan's daughter, Pocahontas, intervened to save his life. This story has been romanticized over centuries but reflects the complex and often fraught relationships between the English and native peoples. Another key figure was John Rolfe, who in 1612 introduced a new variety of tobacco to the colony. This tobacco proved to be a cash crop that could be grown on a large scale and sold back to Europe, giving the colony an economic lifeline. Tobacco farming required a lot of labor, which led to the increased use of indentured servants and, eventually, enslaved Africans, profoundly shaping the social and economic landscape. By 1619, Jamestown had evolved in governance and society. The Virginia House of Burgesses was established, the first elected legislative assembly in the Americas. This pioneering form of self-government laid the groundwork for democratic principles that would echo in American history. At the same time, the colony saw the arrival of the first recorded Africans brought to English North America, marking the beginning of a tragic and complex chapter in the continent's history. Life in Jamestown was a mixture of hope and hardship. Settlers built wooden homes, cultivated tobacco fields, and struggled to maintain order in a place where the threat of disease, starvation, and conflict was never far away. Despite all its trials, Jamestown endured and grew, becoming the foundation of English America. It was a place where the seeds of the future United States were first planted, through a combination of cultural exchange, conflict, economic experimentation, and governance. Jamestown's story is not just about survival. It is about human resilience and the clash and blending of cultures. It symbolizes the beginning of a new chapter where people from different worlds met, sometimes clashed, sometimes cooperated, but ultimately shaped the future of a continent. The Pilgrims and Plymouth Colony. The story of the Pilgrims and the Plymouth Colony begins with a group of English separatists who were driven not only by the pursuit of new lands but by a deep desire for religious freedom. These were people who felt out of place in the Church of England, seeking to practice their faith without interference, persecution, or compromise. Their journey, filled with hardship and hope, became one of the most enduring chapters in early American history. The Pilgrims originally fled England to the Netherlands, where religious tolerance was greater. Yet, life there was not easy. Economic hardship and fears of losing their English identity made them look once again across the Atlantic for a new home. In 1620, about 102 passengers boarded the Mayflower, a small, weather-beaten ship, leaving behind familiar shores for the uncertainties of the New World. Their destination was supposed to be near the Hudson River, within the bounds of the Virginia Company's territory. But after a grueling 66-day voyage battered by storms and rough seas, the Mayflower landed far to the north, on the rocky coast of present-day Massachusetts. With winter approaching, the Pilgrims chose to settle at Plymouth, a site near Cape Cod. The harsh climate and unfamiliar terrain posed immediate challenges. The winter of 1620 to 1621 was brutal, with nearly half the settlers dying from exposure, scurvy, and malnutrition. Yet those who survived demonstrated remarkable resilience. Early on, the Pilgrims forged crucial relationships with the Native American peoples, particularly the Wampanoag tribe. This relationship would prove essential to the colony's survival. The story of Squanto, a Native American who spoke English and taught the Pilgrims how to cultivate corn, fish, and gather resources, is one of cooperation amid cultural difference. In the autumn of 1621, Plymouth Colony celebrated what we now recognize as the First Thanksgiving, a feast shared between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, symbolizing a moment of peace and mutual assistance. Governance in Plymouth was also significant. Before disembarking, the settlers signed the Mayflower Compact, a pioneering document establishing self-government and majority rule among the colonists. This compact laid a foundational principle for democracy and community cooperation in America. Plymouth remained a small and struggling colony, often overshadowed by the larger and more prosperous Massachusetts Bay Colony founded a decade later. However, Its legacy in American culture, especially the story of the Pilgrims, Thanksgiving, and religious freedom, has become deeply ingrained. The Plymouth experience illustrates themes of survival, adaptation, and community in the face of adversity. It was a fragile beginning but one that echoed through the centuries as an iconic part of American identity. The Massachusetts Bay Colony and Puritan influence. In the early 17th century, another wave of English settlers arrived in New England, this time, driven not just by a quest for religious freedom, but by a powerful desire to create a city upon a hill, a model Christian society based on Puritan beliefs. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, founded in 1630, would become a cornerstone of colonial New England and deeply shape the cultural and political landscape of what would become the United States. The Puritans were a group of English Protestants who sought to purify the Church of England from practices they saw as too closely tied to Catholicism. Unlike the separatists who left the Church altogether, like the Pilgrims, the Puritans believed they could reform the Church from within, but many faced persecution at home for their strict religious views. Led by John Winthrop, a wealthy and educated lawyer, about 1,000 Puritans set sail on the Arbella and other ships, aiming to establish a new community in New England that would serve as a shining example of godly living. Winthrop famously described their mission as building a city upon a hill, a beacon of righteousness that would inspire the world. Upon arrival, the Puritans quickly organized a theocratic society where church and state were intertwined, and religious conformity was enforced. The colony's government was run by male church members, and strict moral codes governed daily life. Education was highly valued, with an emphasis on reading the Bible, leading to the establishment of schools and Harvard College in 1636, the first college in America. The Puritan influence extended far beyond religion. It shaped social norms, politics, and community structure. Town meetings became a hallmark of self-government, where local decisions were made democratically among eligible citizens, fostering a tradition of civic participation. However, the Puritan experiment was not without its contradictions and conflicts. Religious dissenters such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson challenged the strict orthodoxy, advocating for greater religious freedom and separation of church and state. Their dissent led to banishment and the founding of new colonies like Rhode Island, which embraced religious tolerance more fully. The Puritan legacy is complex. On one hand, they established institutions of education, governance, and community organization that influenced the development of American democracy. On the other, their intolerance for differing beliefs and harsh punishments for perceived moral failings reflected a rigid worldview. Economically, the Massachusetts Bay Colony prospered through farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. Its strategic location along the Atlantic coast facilitated commerce with England and other colonies, further boosting its growth. As the largest and most influential New England colony, Massachusetts Bay became a center of Puritan culture and power. It played a key role in early conflicts like King Philip's War and the Salem witch trials, dark episodes that reveal both the strengths and flaws of this society. Ultimately, the Massachusetts Bay Colony's mix of religious zeal, political experimentation, and community building set important precedents. Its story is one of ambition, faith, and the struggle to balance order and freedom, a dynamic that would echo through American history. The growth of the 13 colonies and regional differences. By the late 17th century, the English colonies in North America had multiplied and expanded, growing from a few isolated settlements like Jamestown and Plymouth into 13 distinct colonies along the Atlantic coast. These colonies, while all under British rule, began to develop unique identities, economies, and social structures shaped by geography, resources, and the backgrounds of their settlers. The 13 colonies can broadly be divided into 3 regions: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. Each had distinct characteristics that influenced their culture, economy, and political life. New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New Hampshire, were heavily influenced by Puritan settlers. These colonies focused on small-scale farming, fishing, lumber, and shipbuilding. Town life and tight-knit communities emphasized religion, education, and local governance through town meetings. The rocky soil and harsher climate limited large plantations but fostered a culture of industriousness and cooperation. Middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were more diverse ethnically and religiously. These colonies became known as the breadbasket for their fertile soil and grain production. Quakers, Dutch, Germans, and other groups settled here, creating a relatively tolerant and pluralistic society. Cities like Philadelphia and New York emerged as important commercial hubs, linking the colonies to global trade networks. Southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, relied heavily on agriculture, particularly cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. The climate and fertile soil allowed large plantations to flourish, supported increasingly by enslaved African labor. Society here was more hierarchical and aristocratic, with wealth concentrated among plantation owners, and fewer towns or cities compared to the north. These regional differences had profound effects on the development of colonial society. For instance, the New England emphasis on education and community participation contrasted sharply with the South's plantation economy and social stratification. Meanwhile, the Middle Colony's diversity fostered a culture of religious freedom and economic flexibility. As the colonies grew, so did their self-governance structures. While all were subject to the British Crown, many developed their own legislative assemblies, courts, and local governments. This growing political experience laid the groundwork for future challenges to British authority. However, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Land disputes with Native Americans, conflicts between settlers of different origins, and debates over governance and taxation would increasingly shape colonial politics. The expansion of the colonies also brought a surge in immigration, both voluntary and forced, including indentured servants and enslaved Africans, further complicating social dynamics. By 1700, the 13 colonies formed a patchwork of diverse but interconnected societies, each navigating the challenges of survival, economy, and governance in the New World. This regional diversity would play a critical role in shaping the future United States, influencing its culture, economy, and political struggles. The role of Native Americans in early colonial history. When English settlers first arrived in the early 1600s, the lands they called the New World were already home to millions of Native Americans, diverse peoples with rich cultures, languages, and complex societies. Understanding the role Native Americans played during the early colonial period is essential to grasp the true story of America's beginnings. Long before Europeans crossed the Atlantic, Native American tribes had established sophisticated networks of trade, agriculture, and diplomacy. From the Iroquois Confederacy in the northeast to the Powhatan Confederacy in Virginia, these nations controlled vast territories and resources, shaped by centuries of tradition. The arrival of English colonists disrupted this balance in profound ways. At first, many Native Americans engaged in trade and diplomacy with the settlers. For example, the Wampanoag tribe's assistance to the Pilgrims in Plymouth was vital for their survival, teaching them how to grow crops like corn and navigate the unfamiliar environment. However, these relationships were fragile. European expansion led to increasing competition for land and resources, sparking frequent conflicts. The differing worldviews about land ownership, communal use by Native Americans versus private ownership by Europeans, were a root cause of misunderstanding and violence. Several major conflicts between Native Americans and settlers marked the 17th century. One of the most significant was King Philip's War, 1675 to 1678, named after Metacom, known as King Philip, a Wampanoag leader who united various tribes in resistance against English encroachment. This brutal war devastated New England, resulting in massive casualties on both sides and ultimately weakening Native American presence in the region. In the southern colonies, the Powhatan Wars represented a series of violent clashes as the English colony of Virginia expanded. The initial uneasy alliance formed by John Smith and Chief Powhatan gave way to hostility and warfare as colonists pushed further into native lands. Native Americans also influenced colonial society in unexpected ways. They introduced new crops like maize, beans, and squash, which became staples of colonial agriculture. Native knowledge of the land, hunting, and survival techniques was crucial to early settlers. Yet, the consequences for Native Americans were devastating. Disease introduced by Europeans, smallpox, measles, and influenza, wiped out large portions of indigenous populations who had no immunity. Combined with warfare and displacement, these factors led to the near collapse of many tribes. The colonial period was thus a time of both cooperation and tragic conflict. Native Americans were not just passive victims but active agents navigating the shifting tides of power, diplomacy, and survival. Their legacy is intertwined with the foundation of American history, and their stories remind us of the complex human drama at the continent's dawn. The introduction of African slavery and its impact. The arrival of African slavery in the American colonies was a pivotal moment that reshaped the social, economic, and moral landscape of early America. It was not merely a footnote in history but a fundamental system that would leave a lasting impact for centuries to come. Slavery had existed in various forms throughout human history, but the transatlantic slave trade that began in the 15th century was unprecedented in scale and brutality. European powers, fueled by the demands of their colonies in the Americas, engaged in capturing, transporting, and enslaving millions of Africans. In the early 1600s, English colonies in North America began to adopt slavery as a labor system. The first recorded arrival of enslaved Africans in what would become the United States was in 1619, when a Dutch ship brought about 20 Africans to Jamestown, Virginia. Initially, their status was somewhat ambiguous. Some were treated as indentured servants who might earn freedom, but this changed quickly. As colonial economies expanded, particularly in the southern colonies, the demand for cheap, reliable labor skyrocketed. Plantations growing tobacco, rice, and indigo required intensive labor, and enslaved Africans became the backbone of this system. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans were considered property for life, and their children were born into slavery. The establishment of racial slavery was codified through laws that institutionalized the inferior status of Africans and their descendants. These laws stripped enslaved people of basic rights and imposed brutal punishments. Over time, the colonies developed a rigid racial caste system that linked race and servitude, deepening divisions and justifying oppression. Slavery had profound social and economic consequences. Wealthy plantation owners accumulated vast fortunes and political power, while enslaved Africans endured horrific conditions, forced labor, and the destruction of families. Despite this, enslaved people created rich cultural traditions, resistance strategies, and communities that would shape American culture. Resistance took many forms, from outright rebellion to subtle acts of defiance. Enslaved Africans preserved elements of their heritage, developed new languages and music, and laid the foundations for African American culture. The legacy of slavery is a dark but essential part of American history. It created deep social fractures that would lead to decades of conflict, including the Civil War. Understanding the origins and impacts of slavery is crucial for grasping the complexities of the United States past and its ongoing struggles for equality and justice. The colonial economy and trade. The colonial economy of early America was a dynamic and evolving system that reflected the diversity of the 13 colonies and their connections to the wider Atlantic world. Understanding the economic foundations of colonial life is crucial for appreciating how these fledgling societies developed and laid the groundwork for the future United States. From the beginning, the colonies' economies were shaped by geography and natural resources. New England colonies, with their rocky soil and harsh winters, focused on small-scale farming, fishing, shipbuilding, and trade. The middle colonies boasted fertile land suitable for growing grains, earning them the nickname breadbasket colonies, while the southern colonies thrived on large plantations cultivating tobacco, rice, and indigo. Trade played a vital role in colonial life. The colonies were part of the triangular trade, a complex system connecting Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Raw materials like timber, tobacco, and furs flowed from the colonies to Europe. Manufactured goods were shipped back to the colonies, and enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to work in the plantations. Ports such as Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and Charleston became bustling centers of commerce. Merchants and shipbuilders prospered, creating wealth that helped fund the colony's growth and expansion. The colonial economy was not without challenges. Navigational acts imposed by the British government sought to control colonial trade and ensure profits flowed back to England. These laws restricted the colony's ability to trade freely and sowed seeds of resentment that would grow over time. Despite these restrictions, many colonists found ways to thrive. Local markets developed, artisan trades flourished, and farms produced goods for export. Slavery underpinned much of the southern economy, making it heavily dependent on plantation agriculture. In the towns and cities, a rising merchant class emerged, alongside craftsmen, laborists, and farmers. This economic diversity contributed to the colony's resilience and adaptability. By 1700, the colonial economy had become a vital part of the Atlantic world, interconnected with global markets but also distinct in its regional variations and social implications. These economic patterns would influence colonial society, politics, and ultimately the push for independence. The impact of the Enlightenment on colonial thought. The 18th century was a time of intellectual awakening known as the Enlightenment, a sweeping philosophical movement that emphasized reason, science, individual rights, and skepticism of traditional authority. Originating in Europe, these radical ideas soon found fertile ground across the Atlantic in the American colonies, where they would profoundly influence political thought and the burgeoning desire for self-governance. At the heart of Enlightenment thinking was the belief that knowledge should be grounded in empirical evidence and rational inquiry rather than blind faith or superstition. Thinkers like John Locke argued that all men possess natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and that governments exist by the consent of the governed to protect these rights. Locke's ideas directly challenged the divine right of kings and the absolutist monarchies of Europe, positing instead that authority derives from the people. Colonial intellectuals, clergy, and politicians eagerly embraced these ideas. Pamphlets, books, and newspapers circulated widely, spreading Enlightenment philosophy among educated elites and even ordinary citizens. Benjamin Franklin personified this spirit, his experiments with electricity, invention of the lightning rod, and leadership in civic organizations embodying the Enlightenment ideal of progress through reason. The movement also inspired a critical view of existing institutions and social hierarchies. Colonists began questioning not only the authority of the British Crown, but also the legitimacy of aristocratic privilege and inherited status. This shift was vital in developing revolutionary ideals of equality and republicanism. Moreover, Enlightenment thought influenced the growing emphasis on education and scientific inquiry in colonial society. Institutions like the College of Philadelphia, now the University of Pennsylvania, and the American Philosophical Society encouraged the pursuit of knowledge and public debate. In political terms, Enlightenment ideas gave rise to a vocabulary of rights, liberties, and contracts that colonists would soon wield against British policies. Concepts such as the social contract and separation of powers became central to revolutionary discourse and later shaped the U.S. Constitution. By the mid-18th century, the Enlightenment had created an intellectual climate ripe for change. Colonists were no longer content to be passive subjects but began imagining a society where power was derived from reason and consent, setting the stage for the revolutionary upheaval that would soon engulf the continent. The French and Indian War and its effects on the colonies. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, known globally as the 7 Years' War, was a pivotal conflict that reshaped the political and economic landscape of colonial America. It pitted British forces and their colonial militias against the French and their Native American allies in a fierce struggle for control of North America. At its core, the war was about imperial rivalry and the contest for land and resources in the vast interior territories. The British colonies, expanding westward, collided with French claims stretching from Canada down through the Mississippi River Valley. Native American tribes, who had long lived in these contested lands, allied with one side or the other depending on their interests. The war tested the colony's military abilities, with many colonial militias participating alongside British regulars. Early British setbacks gave way to eventual victories under leaders like William Pitt, culminating in the capture of Quebec and Montreal, effectively ending French power in North America. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 dramatically reshaped the continent, ceding French territories east of the Mississippi to Britain. This victory seemed to secure the future of the British colonies, but it also sowed seeds of future conflict. For one, the war was enormously expensive, leaving Britain deeply in debt. To recoup costs, the British government began imposing taxes and stricter controls on the colonies, such as the Stamp Act and Townshend Acts, igniting widespread colonial resentment. Additionally, Britain's proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains to appease Native Americans, angered colonists eager for expansion. The war also fostered a new sense of American identity. Colonial soldiers who fought alongside British troops realized their own strength and shared experience. However, tensions over funding and military command hinted at future divisions. In sum, the French and Indian War was a turning point. It removed France as a colonial rival but also exposed and deepened the growing rift between Britain and its American colonies, setting the stage for revolution. The Stamp Act crisis and colonial resistance. Following the French and Indian War, Britain faced a staggering national debt and sought to offset war expenses by taxing its American colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765 became the flashpoint for colonial resistance. This law required colonists to purchase official stamps for legal documents, newspapers, licenses, and even playing cards, the first direct tax imposed specifically to raise revenue from the colonies. Colonists viewed this as a dangerous precedent and a violation of their rights. The slogan "No taxation without representation" emerged as a powerful rallying cry. Colonists argued that, since they had no elected representatives in the British Parliament, it was illegal and unjust to impose taxes upon them. Resistance to the Stamp Act was widespread and effective. Colonial assemblies passed resolutions denouncing the tax, merchants organized boycotts of British goods, and secret groups like the Sons of Liberty mobilized protests and intimidation tactics. One of the most famous acts of defiance was the burning of effigies and the harassment of stamp distributors, many of whom resigned rather than enforce the law. The economic impact was significant. British merchants faced losses as colonial consumers refused to buy taxed goods, putting pressure on Parliament. Eventually, in 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act but simultaneously passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever, a statement that kept tensions alive. The Stamp Act crisis marked the first united colonial protest against British policies and forged new political alliances. It awakened a revolutionary spirit that would grow over the next decade. The role of the Sons of Liberty and other patriot groups. In the wake of British taxation and control, colonial resistance coalesced into organized groups that played a crucial role in shaping the revolutionary movement. Among these, the Sons of Liberty became the most famous and influential. Formed initially in response to the Stamp Act, the Sons of Liberty were a secret society of patriots who employed both political advocacy and direct action to oppose British policies. They coordinated protests, disseminated pamphlets, and orchestrated boycotts. Their methods sometimes crossed into intimidation and violence, tar and feathering tax collectors, destroying property, and disrupting British administration became common tactics. While controversial, these actions galvanized public opinion and forced British officials to reconsider enforcement. Other groups emerged with similar goals. Committees of correspondence formed across the colonies to share information and coordinate resistance. These communication networks were vital in creating a unified colonial response to British policies. Women, too, played critical roles. Groups like the Daughters of Liberty organized boycotts of British goods and promoted homemade alternatives, supporting the colonial cause. The Sons of Liberty included notable figures such as Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Paul Revere, who would become key leaders during the Revolution. Through grassroots activism, political discourse, and sometimes violence, these groups helped transform scattered discontent into an organized movement for independence. The Boston Massacre and its political significance. Tensions between colonial citizens and British troops stationed in America escalated dramatically, culminating in the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770, a key event that stirred revolutionary fervor. British soldiers had been deployed to Boston to enforce unpopular laws and quell protests, but their presence exacerbated tensions. On that cold night, a confrontation between a crowd of colonists and soldiers ended with the troops firing into the crowd, killing 5 men. The incident was immediately politicized by colonial leaders. Samuel Adams and others framed it as a brutal attack on innocent colonists, using it to fuel anti-British sentiment. Paul Revere's famous engraving of the event, depicting soldiers firing on peaceful civilians, was widely circulated and became a powerful propaganda tool. The Boston Massacre deepened mistrust and polarized opinions. British officials attempted to calm the situation, withdrawing troops temporarily and putting soldiers on trial, where they were mostly acquitted, further angering the populace. This event illustrated the widening gulf between Britain and the colonies and showcased how violence and propaganda could mobilize public opinion in revolutionary America. The Boston Tea Party and colonial defiance. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act, granting the struggling British East India Company the right to sell tea directly to the colonies, undercutting local merchants. While the tax on tea was low, colonists saw this as another attempt to impose taxation without representation and to establish a monopoly. The Boston Tea Party became the iconic act of colonial defiance. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded 3 British ships docked in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This dramatic protest sent a clear message that the colonies would resist what they viewed as unjust laws and economic control. The British government responded harshly with the Coercive Acts, or Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor and revoking Massachusetts' charter, aiming to punish and isolate the colony. Far from suppressing dissent, these measures united the colonies in solidarity with Massachusetts and set the stage for the First Continental Congress. 2.7 The First Continental Congress and Colonial Unity. In response to the Intolerable Acts, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies convened the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. This was the first unified gathering of colonial leaders to coordinate resistance against British rule. The Congress debated strategies, petitioned the king for redress of grievances, and agreed to a collective boycott of British goods. The assembly symbolized growing colonial unity and political maturity, signaling that the colonies were moving beyond local concerns to a collective identity. While still loyal to the crown, the delegates demanded recognition of their rights and the repeal of oppressive laws. They prepared for the possibility of further conflict, establishing militias and encouraging cooperation. The First Continental Congress laid the groundwork for the eventual declaration of independence and the creation of a united front in the struggle ahead. The role of key colonial leaders in the Revolution. Several charismatic and visionary leaders emerged during this period, whose ideas and actions helped guide the colonies toward independence. Figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and Benjamin Franklin played diverse roles as military commanders, diplomats, writers, and politicians. Washington's leadership of the Continental Army gave the Revolution a disciplined military face, while Jefferson's eloquent writing, including the Declaration of Independence, articulated the cause's ideals. John Adams' legal mind and diplomacy helped secure international support, and Patrick Henry's fiery speeches inspired popular support with his famous "Give me liberty, or give me death" call. Benjamin Franklin's diplomatic skill in France was crucial in gaining allies and aid. Together, these leaders shaped the Revolution's course and legacy. The influence of revolutionary ideas on the colonies. Revolutionary ideas, liberty, equality, republicanism, transformed colonial society and politics. Enlightenment principles blended with religious revivalism to create a powerful ideology that questioned traditional hierarchies and justified rebellion. Pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense reached a wide audience, making the complex case for independence accessible and persuasive. Ideas of natural rights and popular sovereignty became central to colonial debates, influencing the creation of new state constitutions and governance models. This intellectual shift empowered ordinary people to envision a new society based on freedom and justice. The events leading directly to the Declaration of Independence. The years 1774 to 1776 were a whirlwind of escalating tensions and conflict. The battles of Lexington and Concord in April 1775 marked the outbreak of armed conflict. The Second Continental Congress convened, managing the war effort and moving closer to independence. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776, galvanized public opinion. By June 1776, Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution for independence. The Continental Congress appointed a committee, including Jefferson, to draft the Declaration. On July 4, 1776, the Declaration of Independence was adopted, formally breaking the colony's ties to Britain and proclaiming the birth of a new nation. The Articles of Confederation and a Fragile Union. In the wake of the American Revolution and the bold Declaration of Independence, the newly freed colonies faced a monumental question. How would they govern themselves now that British authority was no longer in place? The answer, at first, was found in the Articles of Confederation, a document designed to unify the states under a common cause while preserving their independence and autonomy. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, reflected the deep fear many Americans had of centralized power. After all, they had just fought a war to free themselves from a distant and oppressive monarchy. Under the Articles, the central government was deliberately made weak. There was no president or executive branch, and Congress had limited authority. It could make decisions, but it couldn't enforce them. It could request money from the states, but it couldn't compel payment. There was no power to regulate commerce between states or to levy taxes. At first, the arrangement seemed sufficient. The Revolutionary War had just ended, and the focus was on rebuilding and healing. However, as time passed, the weaknesses of the Articles became glaringly clear. Economic instability swept through the states. Trade between them was complicated by inconsistent laws and tariffs. Foreign nations doubted the credibility of a government that couldn't ensure unity among its own members. One of the most vivid examples of the Articles' failure came in the form of Shays' Rebellion in 1786. In Massachusetts, a group of farmers, many of them war veterans, rose up in protest against high taxes and debts. The rebellion was fueled by economic hardship, and the inability of the federal government to raise troops to suppress it alarmed many leaders. If a group of angry farmers could threaten government buildings without a strong federal response, what did that say about the stability of the nation? This rebellion was a wake-up call. Influential figures like George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison began calling for a stronger national government. They believed the time had come to rethink the structure of American governance and to create a system that could balance the need for unity with the preservation of individual liberties. Thus, the stage was set for the Constitutional Convention, a gathering that would reshape the future of the United States. 3.2 The Constitutional Convention of 1787. In the sweltering summer heat of 1787, 55 delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island notably abstaining, gathered in Philadelphia for what would become one of the most pivotal moments in American history, the Constitutional Convention. Originally intended to revise the Articles of Confederation, the convention quickly transformed into an ambitious project to completely reinvent the framework of American government. The delegates assembled in Independence Hall brought with them a wide variety of experiences, philosophies, and regional interests. Among them were giants of the Revolutionary era, George Washington, who was elected president of the convention and lent it a sense of dignity and unity, James Madison, whose meticulous notes and guiding intellect earned him the title Father of the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, the elder statesman whose wisdom helped smooth tensions, and Alexander Hamilton, whose advocacy for a strong central government shaped key debates. From the outset, it was clear that simple revision of the Articles would not suffice. The delegates closed the doors to the public and press, conducting their work in secret to allow for open, honest deliberation. What followed was months of intense, and often contentious, debate. One of the earliest challenges was the question of representation. Large states like Virginia wanted representation based on population, while smaller states like New Jersey feared being overshadowed and pushed for equal representation. This tension led to the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in the House of Representatives and equal representation in the Senate. It was a crucial solution that allowed the convention to move forward. Another thorny issue was slavery. Southern states, whose economies relied on enslaved labor, demanded that enslaved people be counted toward their state's population for representation purposes, even as they denied them any rights. The result was the morally troubling 3/5 compromise, which counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a person for legislative representation and taxation. It was a compromise that underscored the deep divisions in American society, divisions that would fester and eventually lead to civil war. The structure of the new government emerged through careful negotiation. There would be 3 branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, each with distinct powers and the ability to check and balance the others. The presidency, a new and somewhat controversial office, was created with significant authority but limited by term length and checks from Congress and the judiciary. The delegates also debated the method of electing the president, resulting in the creation of the Electoral College, an indirect system that remains in place today. They established federalism, a division of powers between the national government and the states, designed to balance unity with regional autonomy. By September 17, 1787, the final draft of the Constitution was ready. It was a bold, unprecedented document. Though imperfect and full of compromises, it laid the foundation for a durable and adaptable system of government. Not all delegates signed the finished Constitution. Some, like George Mason and Elbridge Gerry, objected to the lack of a Bill of Rights and feared the potential for centralized tyranny. But the majority endorsed it, and the battle for ratification began. The Constitutional Convention was not merely a legal exercise. It was a reimagining of what governance could be. For the first time, a nation sought to build a government not around monarchy or inherited privilege, but around principles of balance, liberty, and representative democracy. The ratification debates and the Federalist Papers. With the Constitution signed in Philadelphia, the next challenge was securing its acceptance by the people. According to Article 7 of the new document, the Constitution would only take effect after 9 of the 13 states ratified it. This set the stage for a fierce national debate, a battle of ideas, fears, and philosophies that would ultimately define the soul of the new republic. The debate split Americans into two camps: Federalists, who supported the Constitution, and Anti-Federalists, who opposed it. The Federalists believed that the new government provided the necessary structure to hold the fragile Union together. They argued that only a strong, centralized government could regulate commerce, maintain order, and defend the nation. Meanwhile, Anti-Federalists feared that the Constitution would create a powerful central authority that might trample the rights of individuals and the sovereignty of the states. In newspapers, pamphlets, and town meetings across the states, the two sides made their cases. The Federalists, led by prominent figures such as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, launched a persuasive campaign of essays now known collectively as the Federalist Papers. Published under the pseudonym Publius, these 85 essays provided reasoned arguments in favor of the Constitution, addressing the concerns of skeptics and articulating the philosophical foundation of the new government. Alexander Hamilton, the most prolific contributor, emphasized the dangers of disunion and the necessity of a government strong enough to govern effectively, yet restrained enough to preserve liberty. James Madison, in the famous Federalist No. 10, introduced the concept of the extended republic. He argued that a large, diverse republic would prevent any single faction from dominating, an idea that helped to calm fears about tyranny. In Federalist No. 51, Madison explained the principles of checks and balances, and the importance of separating powers among the three branches of government. Despite these compelling arguments, the Anti-Federalists were not easily swayed. They worried that the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights to safeguard individual liberties. They feared that the federal government's power to tax, raise an army, and enforce laws could be abused. Their skepticism was strongest in rural and frontier areas, where suspicion of distant authority ran deep. The ratification process unfolded state by state. Delaware was the first to ratify, followed by Pennsylvania and New Jersey. But the real drama came in the larger and more influential states, Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, where opposition was strong. In Massachusetts, a compromise was brokered. The state would ratify the Constitution with the understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added. This compromise helped sway other hesitant states. Virginia's convention was a battleground. With figures like Patrick Henry and George Mason voicing passionate opposition, the decision was far from certain. But the support of James Madison and George Washington carried great weight, and Virginia narrowly approved ratification. New York's ratification was particularly dramatic. As one of the last major states to decide, its choice carried symbolic and practical importance. After an intense public debate, including the circulation of the Federalist Papers and mounting pressure to preserve national unity, New York ratified the Constitution by a narrow margin. By June 1788, 9 states had ratified the Constitution, making it the law of the land. The remaining states eventually followed, with North Carolina and Rhode Island joining later. The ratification debates were a remarkable exercise in democratic discourse. They demonstrated that the new nation was not only built on revolution but on reasoned argument and public persuasion. The victory of the Federalists laid the foundation for the United States government, but the concerns of the Anti-Federalists were not forgotten. Their insistence on a Bill of Rights would soon lead to one of the most significant developments in American constitutional history, the adoption of the first 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights and the promise of liberty. Though the Constitution had been ratified by the necessary number of states, anxiety still lingered across the young nation. Many Americans remained wary of the new government's power, especially its ability to tax, raise armies, and enforce laws. They feared a repeat of the tyranny they had just overthrown. What would prevent this new centralized authority from infringing on personal freedoms? These fears gave rise to a powerful demand: a Bill of Rights, a clear, written guarantee of the basic liberties that the government could never violate. The pressure was strongest in states like Virginia and Massachusetts, where ratification had only succeeded with the promise that amendments would follow. Even Thomas Jefferson, serving in France at the time, wrote to James Madison insisting that a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government on earth. Madison, initially skeptical of the need for a Bill of Rights, came to understand its importance, not just as a legal safeguard, but as a unifying gesture that could strengthen trust in the new Constitution. He took on the task of drafting the amendments himself. In 1789, Madison introduced a series of amendments to Congress. Drawing from existing state declarations of rights, Enlightenment philosophy, and English common law, he crafted a list of protections that spoke directly to the revolutionary experience. These included freedom of speech, religion, and the press, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, guarantees of due process, and the right to a fair and speedy trial. After debate and revision, 10 of Madison's proposed amendments were adopted and ratified by the states in 1791. These became the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Each amendment addressed a specific abuse the colonists had suffered under British rule. The First Amendment guaranteed freedoms that had been suppressed by the Crown. The Third and Fourth Amendments reflected anger over forced quartering of British troops and invasive searches. The Fifth through Eighth Amendments aimed to protect the accused from arbitrary and cruel punishments. But beyond responding to past grievances, the Bill of Rights helped define the American identity. It was a public declaration of the nation's commitment to individual liberty and limited government. It signaled that even the powerful new federal government would have boundaries. The Bill of Rights also became a foundation for future legal interpretation and civil rights movements. It would be cited in courtrooms, invoked by activists, and held up as a symbol of democratic ideals both at home and around the world. Still, it's important to recognize the limitations of the early Bill of Rights. At the time of its ratification, its protections did not extend to everyone. Enslaved people, Native Americans, and many women remained excluded from its promises. In practice, states often ignored or violated individual rights with impunity. Nonetheless, the Bill of Rights marked a vital step forward. It reflected the ongoing struggle to balance liberty with order and individual rights with collective security. It reassured skeptical citizens that their freedoms would not be sacrificed on the altar of federal power. More than 2 centuries later, the Bill of Rights continues to serve as a touchstone of American democracy. It is both a legal document and a living promise, a declaration that the rights of the people must never be left to the mercy of the powerful. As the 1790s began, the young republic had a new constitution, a framework of checks and balances, and a Bill of Rights. But now came the hard part, putting it all into action. George Washington's presidency and the birth of the executive branch. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry when the United States turned to its first great test, bringing the new government to life. In 1789, Americans elected George Washington as the first president of the United States, a man whose reputation for honor, courage, and self-restraint made him the ideal choice to lead the young republic. His presidency would not just fill an office, it would define the presidency itself. At the time, the office of the president was something of a blank slate. The Constitution outlined the powers of the executive branch, but left much to interpretation. Washington's decisions and demeanor would set critical precedents, what historians often call the unwritten constitution, that shaped the very nature of executive power in the U.S. Washington understood the symbolic weight of his position. Every gesture, every policy, every interaction would be scrutinized and potentially copied by future presidents. As such, he conducted himself with deliberate formality, adopting protocols that maintained the dignity of the office while avoiding the pomp of monarchy. He refused titles like Your Excellency, settling simply for Mr. President. One of his most important early tasks was assembling the first cabinet, the body of advisors that would help manage the government's various departments. Though not specified in the Constitution, the cabinet became a cornerstone of the executive branch. Washington appointed brilliant men to these posts. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. These men did not always agree, especially Hamilton and Jefferson, whose ideological clashes would shape the nation's political future. But Washington valued their input and set a standard for future presidents to seek diverse counsel. Perhaps Washington's most lasting contribution was establishing the principle that the president would serve no more than 2 terms. Though the Constitution did not limit presidential terms at the time, Washington believed that relinquishing power was a hallmark of a true republic. By stepping down after 8 years, he set a precedent that lasted until Franklin D. Roosevelt and was later codified in the 22nd Amendment. But Washington's presidency was not all about symbolism. He tackled serious national challenges that tested the strength of the new government. One of the first was the establishment of a stable financial system. With the country burdened by war debt and lacking revenue, Washington backed Hamilton's plan to assume state debts, create a national bank, and impose taxes to raise funds. These measures, controversial at the time, laid the foundation for a functioning economy and centralized fiscal policy. In 1791, the Whiskey Rebellion broke out in western Pennsylvania in protest of a new federal tax on distilled spirits. Unlike the weak Confederation government during Shays' Rebellion a decade earlier, Washington responded swiftly and decisively. He personally led a militia force, over 10,000 strong, to suppress the uprising. This show of federal strength demonstrated that the new government had both the authority and the will to enforce its laws. Washington also had to manage foreign affairs in a world dominated by imperial powers. The French Revolution, which erupted in 1789, created divisions in American opinion. Jeffersonians sympathized with the French revolutionaries, while Hamiltonians feared radicalism. Washington, ever the steady hand, issued the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, insisting that the U.S. remain uninvolved in European conflicts. This neutrality would shape American foreign policy for generations. In 1795, Washington supported Jay's Treaty with Britain, a controversial agreement that averted war and resolved outstanding issues from the Revolutionary War but was criticized by many for being too conciliatory. The treaty marked one of the first major foreign policy disputes in American politics. As his presidency drew to a close, Washington delivered his farewell address, a document now regarded as one of the most important political statements in American history. In it, he warned against entangling foreign alliances, political factionalism, and sectional divisions, offering a vision of national unity that remains relevant even today. Washington's presidency established the norms and structures of the executive branch. He transformed the Constitution's vague outline of a president into a living, breathing office, guided by humility, responsibility, and restraint. He didn't just govern. He embodied what a leader in a republic should be. And in doing so, he helped the United States transition from a fragile confederation to a functioning, respected nation on the global stage. The rise of political parties, Federalists versus Democratic Republicans. In the glow of unity following independence, many of the founding fathers hoped the United States would avoid the divisiveness of political factions. George Washington, in particular, warned against the rise of parties in his farewell address, believing they would divide the country and distract from the common good. But by the mid-1790s, political parties had not only emerged, they were reshaping American political life. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, the nation's first two major political parties, arose from deep ideological divisions within the founding generation. Their origins can be traced back to two men, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, both of whom had served in George Washington's cabinet but held profoundly different visions for the country. The Federalists, order, industry, and a strong central government. The Federalist Party, led by Hamilton and supported by figures like John Adams, believed in a strong central government that could foster economic growth, maintain order, and secure the nation's place in the world. They favored a robust national bank, close ties with Britain for trade and stability, a strong executive branch, support for merchants, manufacturers, and urban elites. Hamilton envisioned a modern economy driven by industry and finance. He believed that consolidating state debts, establishing a national bank, and encouraging manufacturing would place the U.S. on a path toward greatness. His financial programs, such as the assumption of state debts and the excise tax, which later sparked the Whiskey Rebellion, reflected these priorities. Federalists tended to distrust the masses, viewing them as easily swayed and in need of guidance. They argued that an elite class of educated, property-owning men should lead the republic. Their base of support lay in New England and the northern cities, where commerce and banking flourished. The Democratic Republicans, agrarian liberty and states' rights. Opposing the Federalists were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. This party championed the ideals of the Revolution: liberty, individual rights, and a limited federal government. Their platform included strict interpretation of the Constitution, opposition to the national bank, strong state governments, a vision of an agrarian, self-sustaining republic. Jefferson feared that Hamilton's economic policies would create a powerful central authority too similar to the British monarchy they had just overthrown. He worried that the national bank would benefit wealthy elites and undermine the independence of farmers and small landowners. Democratic Republicans believed in the virtue of the common man, especially the yeoman farmer, who was seen as the backbone of the republic. Their support came largely from the South and the Western frontier, where distrust of federal authority ran deep. Foreign affairs deepened the divide. International events further intensified party rivalries. The French Revolution, which began in 1789, split American opinion. Federalists recoiled at the revolution's violent turn and supported neutrality or closer ties with Britain. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, admired the French struggle for liberty and viewed Britain as a lingering imperial threat. This division came to a head during the quasi-war with France in the late 1790s, when Federalists pushed for military buildup and harsh anti-French rhetoric. The Democratic Republicans accused them of warmongering and violating civil liberties. The election of 1796, parties take the stage. The Louisiana Purchase and Westward Expansion. In the early 19th century, the United States was still a relatively young and compact nation, hugging the eastern seaboard with the Appalachian Mountains as a natural western barrier. Beyond lay vast, largely unexplored territories teeming with potential, but also uncertainty. Everything changed in 1803 with a single, transformative event, the Louisiana Purchase. This deal not only doubled the size of the United States overnight but also marked the beginning of a new era of westward expansion that would define American identity for generations. The backdrop: Napoleon's gamble and Jefferson's opportunity. The Louisiana Territory stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, encompassing what is now 15 U.S. states and parts of Canada. It had changed hands several times between European powers, but by the early 1800s, it was under the control of Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France. Napoleon, embroiled in European wars and facing a slave revolt in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, began to lose interest in maintaining France's North American empire. Meanwhile, the United States, under President Thomas Jefferson, was deeply concerned about French control of New Orleans, a key port for American trade. Jefferson initially authorized negotiations to purchase New Orleans and parts of Florida for $10 million. But in a stunning twist, Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. The deal was too good to pass up. On April 30, 1803, the United States signed the Louisiana Purchase Agreement. At just 4 cents per acre, it was arguably the greatest land deal in history. A constitutional dilemma for Jefferson. While Jefferson celebrated the opportunity, he also wrestled with a constitutional dilemma. As a strict constructionist, he believed the federal government could only exercise powers specifically granted by the Constitution, and land acquisition was not among them. Still, Jefferson reasoned that the purchase was in the nation's best interest. He framed it as part of the president's power to negotiate treaties, and Congress quickly approved the deal. Jefferson's decision demonstrated a pragmatic streak that would shape the presidency and expand the interpretation of federal power. The Lewis and Clark expedition, charting the unknown. With the territory acquired, Jefferson turned to exploring the vast new lands. He commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to lead the Corps of Discovery, a 2-year expedition that set out from St. Louis in 1804. Their mission was to map the new territory, identify routes to the Pacific Ocean, establish relationships with Native American tribes, document plants, animals, and geography. Accompanied by a diverse team, including the famed Shoshone interpreter Sacagawea, the expedition traversed rivers, mountains, and plains, gathering invaluable scientific and cultural knowledge. Their journey helped cement a mythic image of the West as a place of opportunity and adventure, sparking the imagination of generations of Americans. Impact on Native Americans, displacement and resistance. While the Louisiana Purchase was a boon for American settlers, it marked the beginning of a tragic era for Native American peoples. The expansion brought settlers into direct conflict with indigenous nations who had lived on the land for centuries. Treaties were made and broken, lands were taken, and displacement became widespread. Tribes such as the Osage, Sioux, and Cheyenne found themselves confronting an unstoppable tide of American migration. This era saw the early stages of what would become a long and painful saga of forced removal, warfare, and broken promises that continued throughout the 19th century. Economic and political implications. The Louisiana Purchase altered the nation's economic trajectory. The fertile lands of the Mississippi Valley soon became America's agricultural heartland. Crops like wheat, corn, and cotton flourished, fueling both domestic growth and international trade. Politically, the acquisition exacerbated tensions between North and South. As new territories opened up for settlement, the question arose: would they allow slavery? This would become a defining issue in the decades ahead, sowing seeds for the Civil War. Manifest destiny begins to take root. Though the term manifest destiny would not be coined until the 1840s, the spirit behind it was already present in the Louisiana Purchase. Americans began to see westward expansion as a divine mission, a right, even a duty, to spread their civilization from coast to coast. This belief would guide U.S. policy for the next century, driving everything from the annexation of Texas to the conquest of California and the war with Mexico. Settlement and the rise of the frontier. The acquisition opened up millions of acres for settlement. Pioneers, farmers, and land speculators poured westward, braving harsh conditions to build new lives. The frontier became a symbol of American grit and independence, immortalized in folklore and later in Hollywood. The federal government encouraged this migration through land grants and infrastructure projects, including roads and, later, railroads. Towns sprang up, trade routes expanded, and the nation's physical and cultural map began to change dramatically. New challenges and responsibilities. The Louisiana Purchase also forced the federal government to confront new administrative challenges. How would this vast land be governed? How would territories transition into states? How would indigenous populations be treated? Jefferson and his successors had to devise systems of governance, law enforcement, and diplomacy for lands that many Americans had never seen and knew little about. A foundation for future power. By acquiring Louisiana, the United States had effectively removed France from the North American equation, eliminated a major threat to Western expansion, and laid the groundwork for a continental empire. The Mississippi River became an internal artery of commerce, connecting the interior with global markets. Ports like New Orleans grew in significance, and the nation's center of gravity began to shift westward. Conclusion: a nation transformed. The Louisiana Purchase was more than a real estate deal. It was a transformation of national identity. It challenged old assumptions, expanded the scope of the Constitution, and gave rise to the idea that the United States was destined for greatness on a continental scale. It sparked curiosity, ambition, and conflict. It forged new heroes, broke old traditions, and set in motion a series of events that would shape the nation's destiny. From the ink on the treaty to the boot prints of pioneers, the Louisiana Purchase left a lasting mark on America, a mark still visible in its landscape, culture, and collective imagination. By the early 20th century, the United States expanded its influence globally. Spanish-American War, 1898, marked America's emergence as an imperial power. U.S. acquired territories such as Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, building the Panama Canal. The canal facilitated global trade and military movement, symbolized U.S. engineering prowess and geopolitical reach. World War I and aftermath. U.S. initially neutral but entered in 1917. Helped Allied victory and reshaped global order. Refused to join the League of Nations, signaling isolationist tendencies. Summary. These decades laid the groundwork for modern America, industrial powerhouse, global actor, and nation grappling with social change and democracy's challenges. Starting now with Heading 5, the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression, and then I'll cover subheadings 5.1 through 5.10 in detail. The Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. The 1920s in the United States was an era of dramatic cultural and economic change, a decade often called the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of booming prosperity, social liberation, and technological innovation. However, this exuberance was sharply contrasted by the devastating crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression, which plunged millions into poverty and reshaped American society. The economic boom of the 1920s. The 1920s witnessed unprecedented economic growth. After World War I, the U.S. economy surged, fueled by technological innovations and new consumer products. Mass production. Techniques pioneered by Henry Ford revolutionized manufacturing. The assembly line made cars, radios, and household appliances affordable for many Americans. Consumer culture. Advertising grew, persuading Americans to buy the latest goods. Department stores and credit buying became widespread. Stock market growth. The stock market soared as people invested with optimism, often borrowing money to buy shares. Urbanization. More Americans moved to cities, which thrived with new jobs and entertainment options. Government policies, pro-business policies, low taxes, and limited regulation encouraged investment and corporate expansion. This era felt like an unending upward climb, with optimism about America's future prosperity. Social change and the Jazz Age. The Roaring Twenties was also a period of profound social transformation, particularly among the youth and in urban centers. The Jazz Age, jazz music, born from African American communities, became wildly popular nationwide. It symbolized freedom and modernity. Flappers and new roles for women. Young women challenged traditional norms by adopting new fashions, behaviors, and attitudes. The 19th Amendment, 1920, gave women the right to vote, fueling greater social independence. Harlem Renaissance, a cultural movement celebrating African American art, literature, and music flourished in Harlem, New York. Changing morals, attitudes towards sex, dating, and personal freedom became more liberal, though this caused backlash among conservatives. The decade was defined by a spirit of rebellion and cultural experimentation. Prohibition and organized crime. The 18th Amendment, 1919, ushered in prohibition, banning the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol. Rise of speakeasies. Illegal bars flourished, becoming social hubs. Bootlegging. Smugglers supplied alcohol, often controlled by organized crime syndicates. Gangsters. Figures like Al Capone amassed power and wealth through illegal liquor trade. Law enforcement struggles. Corruption and violence increased as authorities struggled to enforce prohibition laws. Public opinion. Many Americans opposed prohibition, leading to its repeal in 1933 with the 21st Amendment. Prohibition showed the limits of moral legislation and had lasting impacts on American law enforcement. The stock market speculation. The 1920s stock market boom was characterized by rampant speculation. Buying on margin, investors purchased stocks with borrowed money, inflating prices beyond real values. Speculative frenzy. Many bought stocks based on hype rather than fundamentals. Lack of regulation. Minimal government oversight allowed risky practices to flourish. Warnings ignored. Economists and investors cautioned about bubbles, but enthusiasm prevailed. The bubble bursts, October 29, 1929, known as Black Tuesday, saw a catastrophic stock market crash. This event would trigger a chain reaction leading to the Great Depression. The Great Depression begins. Following the crash, the U.S. economy spiraled downward. Bank failures. Many banks collapsed, wiping out savings. Unemployment soared. By 1933, nearly 25% of Americans were jobless. Business closures. Factories and farms shuttered, reducing production. Widespread poverty. Families lost homes and faced hunger. Psychological impact. The Depression shattered American confidence and hope. It was a period of hardship and uncertainty unlike any before in U.S. history. Government response to the crisis. Initially, the federal government's response was limited. Herbert Hoover's policies, focused on voluntary cooperation and limited relief, seen as ineffective. Public criticism. Hoover was blamed for the worsening conditions. New Deal beginnings. The election of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 marked a shift toward active government intervention. Emergency measures, banking reforms, job programs, and social welfare initiatives were launched. The role of government expanded dramatically to combat the Depression. The New Deal programs. Roosevelt's New Deal reshaped American politics and society through a series of programs aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. Relief, direct aid to the unemployed and poor, e.g., CCC, WPA. Recovery, efforts to revive industry and agriculture. Reform, regulations to prevent future economic crises, e.g., SEC, Social Security. Labor rights, the Wagner Act supported unionization. Controversies, critics argued about the New Deal's scope and effectiveness, but it helped millions survive. The New Deal left a lasting legacy in government responsibility. Cultural impact of the Depression. Despite hardships, American culture adapted and thrived in new ways. Literature and arts. Writers like John Steinbeck and photographers like Dorothea Lange captured the era's struggles. Movies and radio. Entertainment provided escape and unity. With millions of men serving overseas, American women stepped into roles traditionally reserved for men. Rosie the Riveter became the iconic symbol of women in the wartime workforce. Women worked in shipyards, aircraft factories, and munitions plants. They handled welding torches, rivet guns, and heavy machinery with skill and determination. By 1945, nearly 19 million women were employed, many in roles critical to the war effort. This shift not only filled a vital labor gap but also permanently altered the perception of women's capabilities and place in the American workforce. African Americans and war production. Despite facing systemic racism and segregation, African Americans contributed significantly to wartime industry. The Double V campaign, Victory Abroad against Fascism and Victory at Home against Racism, inspired Black Americans to demand equal treatment. Leaders like A. Philip Randolph pressured the Roosevelt administration to address discriminatory hiring practices. This led to the creation of the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC, which aimed to reduce racial discrimination in war industries. While inequality persisted, the war opened new opportunities for African Americans and laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement to come. Economic impact. The war effort ended the Great Depression once and for all. Unemployment vanished as industries expanded and government spending skyrocketed. War bonds were sold to finance military operations, and Americans on the home front eagerly participated, seeing it as a patriotic duty. GDP soared from $88.6 billion in 1939 to over $200 billion by 1945. Personal incomes rose, and millions of Americans experienced prosperity for the first time. The combination of full employment, industrial production, and scientific progress made the United States an economic powerhouse, and the undisputed leader of the post-war world. The GI Bill and long-term economic transformation. Anticipating the post-war transition, the Roosevelt administration introduced the GI Bill of Rights in 1944. It provided returning veterans with access to education, housing loans, and business grants. This single policy helped create a generation of educated, home-owning Americans who would build the post-war middle class. The industrial expansion of the 1940s laid the foundation for decades of American prosperity and global economic influence. Legacy of innovation. The technological and logistical advancements achieved during the war didn't disappear with the conflict's end. Instead, they spilled over into peacetime industries. Jet engines, radar, early computers, and nuclear power all had their origins in wartime innovation. The same methods of mass production that built bombers would soon be building cars and consumer goods on an unprecedented scale. World War II fundamentally changed the way America worked, produced, and innovated, and its effects would be felt long after the final shot was fired. The soldiers' stories, life on the front lines. Behind every battle map and military strategy in World War II were millions of young American soldiers, ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. These men, drawn from cities, farms, and small towns across the country, endured some of the most challenging conditions imaginable on the front lines in Europe, the Pacific, and beyond. From civilians to soldiers. Most American servicemen were drafted or volunteered in their late teens or early 20s. For many, it was their first time leaving home. Training camps were scattered across the U.S., where recruits learned everything from firing a rifle to surviving on limited rations. These training grounds became melting pots, where men from every background came together with a shared purpose. Despite differences in race, class, and geography, bonds formed quickly through shared hardship and camaraderie. The European Theater. American troops landed in North Africa in 1942 and later stormed beaches in Italy and France. Life in these regions meant trench foot, freezing winters, and constant artillery bombardments. Soldiers slept in foxholes or bombed-out buildings. They marched through muddy terrain under constant threat of sniper fire and landmines. Letters from home were cherished, while food was often cold and sparse. The D-Day invasion in June 1944 was particularly brutal. Over 150,000 troops landed in Normandy, with many facing withering German machine gun fire as they stepped off landing craft. Victory came at a cost, and the beaches were soaked in blood. The Pacific Front. In contrast, soldiers in the Pacific fought jungle warfare against a determined and often unseen enemy. The conditions were oppressive. Heat, insects, and disease were constant enemies alongside Japanese troops. Battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa tested American endurance to the limit. Many soldiers suffered from malaria, dysentery, and psychological strain. The terrain was unfamiliar and treacherous. Enemy soldiers were deeply entrenched and often fought to the death. Despite it all, U.S. forces pressed on, adapting to every challenge thrown at them. Brotherhood in battle. One of the defining features of military service was the deep bonds soldiers formed. These weren't just friendships, they were lifelines. Trusting the man beside you could mean the difference between life and death. Soldiers often referred to each other as brothers. They shared cigarettes, foxholes, and stories from back home. Humor was a survival mechanism, used to break tension and keep spirits alive. These bonds remained strong long after the war, forming the basis of reunions, memoirs, and veterans organizations. The psychological toll. War changed these men forever. Many returned home physically unscathed but emotionally scarred. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, wasn't formally recognized, but shell shock and battle fatigue were terms used to describe the invisible wounds soldiers carried. Nightmares, anxiety, and depression followed many veterans. Some struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Others turned to alcohol or isolated themselves. Still, many coped by staying connected to fellow veterans or finding purpose in building new lives back home. Acts of heroism. The war was filled with moments of extraordinary bravery. Medal of Honor recipients often risked or gave their lives to save others. These were not superhumans, just everyday men pushed to greatness by the moment. paratroopers who jumped behind enemy lines, medics who ran through gunfire to treat the wounded, infantrymen who held positions against overwhelming odds. Their stories became part of America's enduring military legacy. Black soldiers and segregation. African American troops served valiantly despite being placed in segregated units. Many worked in support roles, but others, like the Tuskegee Airmen and the 761st Tank Battalion, broke barriers and earned respect on the battlefield. These units often faced discrimination at home and abroad. Yet they proved their mettle and paved the way for desegregation in the military after the war. Their experiences highlighted both the challenges and contributions of Black Americans during World War II. Letters and voices from the war. One of the most intimate glimpses into a soldier's life came through their letters home. These writings revealed fears, hopes, and deep longing for peace. Letters described brutal conditions, close friendships, and dreams for the future. Many ended with reassurances, "Don't worry about me." These voices, preserved in archives and family keepsakes, offer a powerful record of life on the front lines. Returning home. The end of the war brought joy, relief, and uncertainty. Soldiers returned as heroes, but many struggled with the transition. Some returned to parades and celebrations. Others returned to jobs that no longer existed or families that had changed. The GI Bill helped many reintegrate by offering education and housing, but the emotional burden of war lingered. Lasting legacy. The soldiers of World War II became known as the greatest generation for a reason. Their sacrifices reshaped the world, protected democracy, and established the United States as a global leader. Their stories, filled with courage, pain, and resilience, remain etched in history and inspire generations who follow. The home front. Sacrifice and solidarity. While American soldiers were fighting overseas during World War II, an equally important story was unfolding at home, one of unity, determination, and immense sacrifice. The U.S. home front became a powerful engine of support for the war effort, transforming everyday life for millions of civilians. Total war at home. World War II demanded total mobilization. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, American industries shifted almost overnight from consumer goods to wartime production. Car factories began building tanks and airplanes. Typewriter companies made rifles. Everything, from rubber to food to gasoline, was rationed to ensure that the military had what it needed. Citizens were issued ration books and encouraged to grow victory gardens to supplement their diets. People reused and repurposed everything they could. The slogan "Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without" became a national mantra. Women step up. With millions of men serving overseas, American women filled the gap in the workforce. For the first time, women entered factories, shipyards, and steel mills in massive numbers. Rosie the Riveter became a cultural icon, representing the strength and determination of women on the home front. These women built planes, drove trucks, welded ships, and kept the economy moving. Though many were expected to leave these jobs after the war, their contributions challenged traditional gender roles and helped spark future movements for women's rights. Wartime propaganda and morale. The U.S. government launched a massive propaganda campaign to keep morale high and the public focused. Posters, newsreels, and radio programs encouraged unity, sacrifice, and patriotism. Celebrities and movie stars performed in USO shows and sold war bonds, connecting entertainment with national service. Even Hollywood played a part, producing films that promoted American values and portrayed the Axis powers as evil. Music, too, played a role. From swing bands to sentimental ballads, songs kept spirits up during dark times. Internment of Japanese Americans. One of the darkest chapters of the home front was the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. Following Pearl Harbor, fear and prejudice led to Executive Order 9066, which authorized their forced relocation to camps in remote areas. Families lost homes, businesses, and freedom, all without due process. Despite this injustice, many Japanese Americans still volunteered for military service, most famously in the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team. A nation transformed. The war changed American society in profound ways. African Americans migrated in large numbers from the South to northern cities to take defense jobs, fueling both opportunity and racial tension. Native Americans contributed as well, with the Navajo code talkers playing a crucial role in secure communications in the Pacific. By the end of the war, the United States emerged stronger economically and more united. The shared experience of sacrifice and solidarity on the home front laid the foundation for post-war prosperity and social change. D-Day and the road to victory. On June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. Over 150,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, France, in what became the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. The mission was clear: break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall and begin the liberation of Western Europe. The assault was brutal. Soldiers leapt from landing crafts into churning seas under relentless machine gun fire. Cliffs loomed overhead, riddled with enemy bunkers. Yet, inch by inch, they advanced, crawling through sand, dodging bullets, carrying wounded comrades. Victory on D-Day marked a turning point. Soon, Paris was liberated. American, British, and Canadian forces pushed eastward. Meanwhile, the Soviets advanced from the other side, squeezing the Nazis into a corner. By May 1945, Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and Germany surrendered. After 6 long years of bloodshed, Europe was free. D-Day wasn't just a military operation. It was a symbol of courage, unity, and determination. Ordinary men faced extraordinary odds and changed the course of history. Their bravery lives on in every footstep taken on the sands of Normandy. The atomic bomb and the end of the war. In August 1945, the world witnessed a terrifying leap into the atomic age. After years of brutal fighting in the Pacific, the US made a fateful decision: to drop atomic bombs on Japan in hopes of ending World War II swiftly and decisively. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay released its deadly cargo over Hiroshima. In a blinding flash, the city was devastated. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The destruction was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Tens of thousands died instantly, and many more suffered from radiation in the aftermath. Japan, facing unimaginable devastation and no hope of victory, surrendered on August 15, 1945. World War II was finally over. The atomic bomb brought peace, but at a staggering cost. It opened the door to a new era, where humanity now held the power to destroy itself. The war's end sparked celebration, but also reflection. Could such weapons ever be justified again? The world had changed forever, and the shadow of the mushroom cloud would loom large over global politics for decades to come. Returning home, veterans and the GI Bill. When the guns fell silent, over 16 million American service members returned home, forever changed by the war. They came back with dreams of peace, stability, and a better life. But transitioning from the battlefield to civilian life wasn't easy. Jobs were scarce, homes were limited, and families had grown apart. To help ease this massive transition, the US government passed the GI Bill of Rights in 1944. It was a revolutionary piece of legislation. It offered veterans low-interest home loans, unemployment benefits, and, most importantly, free or subsidized college education. This bill didn't just change lives, it reshaped America. Millions of veterans went to school, learned trades, became doctors, engineers, and teachers. They bought homes in growing suburbs, fueling a booming post-war economy. Climate change remains one of the most critical challenges of our time, requiring cooperation, innovation, and commitment across all nations to protect the planet for future generations. The impact of global pandemics. Global pandemics have shaped human history in profound ways, and the 21st century is no exception. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in late 2019, dramatically altered daily life worldwide, affecting health, economies, and societies. Governments implemented lockdowns, travel restrictions, and mass vaccination campaigns to curb the virus's spread. The pandemic exposed weaknesses in healthcare systems and highlighted inequalities in access to medical resources. Beyond health, COVID-19 accelerated digital transformation as work, education, and socializing moved online. It also sparked global cooperation and debate on public health policies, vaccine distribution, and preparedness for future outbreaks. The pandemic's impact reminds humanity of our interconnectedness and vulnerability, emphasizing the need for global solidarity and resilience in the face of shared challenges. The evolution of artificial space exploration. In recent decades, space exploration has entered a thrilling new phase with private companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, and others joining government agencies. These companies have revolutionized access to space by developing reusable rockets and ambitious plans for colonizing Mars. The launch of satellites for communication, GPS, and Earth monitoring has transformed daily life. Missions to Mars and the Moon are expanding scientific understanding and inspiring dreams of humans living beyond Earth. International cooperation on the International Space Station shows how space can unite nations. Meanwhile, robotic probes venture into deep space, uncovering secrets of our solar system and beyond. This era of space exploration combines innovation, competition, and collaboration, promising to redefine humanity's place in the universe. The future of global connectivity. As technology continues to advance, the future of global connectivity promises even greater integration. Innovations like 5G networks, satellite internet constellations, and the Internet of Things, IoT, are transforming how people and devices connect. 5G offers faster speeds and lower latency, enabling real-time communication, autonomous vehicles, and smart cities. Satellite projects like Starlink aim to bring high-speed internet to remote and underserved areas, bridging the digital divide. The Internet of Things connects everyday objects, from refrigerators to traffic lights, creating smarter environments that optimize resources and improve quality of life. However, increased connectivity also raises concerns about cybersecurity, privacy, and the ethical use of data. The challenge lies in harnessing these technologies responsibly to ensure inclusive and secure global networks. The future holds immense potential for a more connected, efficient, and collaborative world. The Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. The Civil Rights Movement was a pivotal period in American history, marked by widespread activism against racial segregation and discrimination. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X inspired millions to demand equality. Nonviolent protests, marches, and legal battles led to significant legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws outlawed segregation and protected voting rights, reshaping American society. The movement highlighted the power of grassroots organizing and moral courage, influencing future social justice efforts worldwide. Despite progress, the struggle for racial equality continues, reminding us of the ongoing journey toward justice. Women's rights and feminism. The fight for women's rights has been a long and transformative journey, gaining momentum in the 20th century with waves of feminism advocating for equality in voting, education, and the workplace. The early 1900s saw women win the right to vote in the U.S. with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Later, the second wave of feminism in the 1960s and 70s tackled broader issues like reproductive rights, equal pay, and challenging societal norms. Movements like #MeToo in the 2010s brought renewed focus on sexual harassment and gender violence, empowering survivors and sparking global conversations. Women's rights movements continue to evolve, striving for intersectional equality that considers race, class, and sexual orientation, pushing societies toward greater justice and inclusion. LGBTQ+ rights movement. The LGBTQ+ rights movement has made remarkable strides in the past century, fighting for acceptance, equal rights, and legal protections for sexual and gender minorities. From the early days of the Stonewall riots in 1969, which ignited a global push against discrimination, to the legalization of same-sex marriage in many countries, the movement has challenged societal norms and prejudice. Activists have worked tirelessly to combat violence, promote healthcare access, and secure workplace protections. Pride parades and awareness campaigns have increased visibility and fostered community. Despite progress, many LGBTQ+ individuals still face discrimination and legal hurdles, especially in parts of the world where homosexuality remains criminalized. The movement continues to grow, advocating for full equality and celebrating diversity across all identities. Environmental justice movement. The environmental justice movement emerged from the recognition that environmental problems disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Often, low-income neighborhoods and people of color face higher exposure to pollution, toxic waste, and industrial hazards. This movement seeks to address these inequalities by demanding fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in environmental policies and decisions. It connects social justice with ecological concerns, emphasizing that healthy environments are a human right. Grassroots activism, legal battles, and public awareness campaigns have pushed governments and corporations to consider the impact of their actions on vulnerable populations. The environmental justice movement has broadened the environmental conversation, highlighting that protecting the planet also means fighting for equity and human dignity. Disability rights movement. The disability rights movement strives for equal opportunities, accessibility, and dignity for people with disabilities. Emerging prominently in the mid-20th century, it challenged societal barriers, discrimination, and exclusion. Landmark legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, of 1990 transformed public spaces, workplaces, and schools, ensuring accommodations and prohibiting discrimination. Activists emphasized the social model of disability, focusing on removing societal barriers rather than fixing individuals. Efforts continue to promote inclusive education, employment, and accessibility in technology. The 20th century brought automobiles, airplanes, and eventually space travel, opening up new possibilities for exploration, commerce, and cultural exchange. Advances like electric vehicles and high-speed rail today reflect ongoing efforts to create more sustainable and efficient transportation systems. These technologies have not only accelerated globalization but also impacted economies, urban development, and daily life, making the world more accessible than ever before. Medical innovations and public health. Medical advancements over the last 5 centuries have transformed public health and increased life expectancy worldwide. From the discovery of vaccines to the development of antibiotics, these innovations have dramatically reduced mortality rates. The understanding of germ theory in the 19th century revolutionized sanitation and disease prevention. Later, breakthroughs such as X-rays, anesthesia, and organ transplants have made complex treatments possible. Public health initiatives, including sanitation systems and vaccination campaigns, have played a crucial role in controlling epidemics and improving overall health. Today, cutting-edge technologies like genetic engineering and telemedicine continue to advance medicine, offering hope for curing diseases and improving quality of life globally. The space race and exploration. The mid-20th century witnessed an extraordinary leap in technological ambition with the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Sparked by Cold War rivalry, this competition pushed humanity beyond Earth's boundaries for the first time. In 1969, the Apollo 11 mission famously landed the first humans on the moon, marking a monumental achievement in science and engineering. This milestone symbolized not only technological prowess but also the power of human curiosity and determination. Space exploration has since expanded to include satellites, space stations, and robotic missions to Mars and beyond, deepening our understanding of the universe. Today, private companies are entering the space industry, promising new possibilities for space tourism, colonization, and scientific discovery, opening an exciting frontier for the future. The digital revolution and information age. The digital revolution, beginning in the late 20th century, marks a major shift from analog to digital technology, reshaping industries and daily life. The widespread adoption of computers, mobile devices, and the internet created the information age, where data became a crucial asset. This era has transformed communication, enabling instant global connectivity, and revolutionized sectors like finance, education, and entertainment. The rise of smartphones and social media platforms further accelerated this transformation, changing how people interact and access information. However, the digital revolution also introduced challenges such as cybersecurity threats, privacy concerns, and the digital divide, which continues to affect access in many regions. Despite these issues, The ongoing digital transformation drives innovation and shapes the modern world in profound ways. Renewable energy technologies. As concerns over climate change have grown, the development and adoption of renewable energy technologies have become crucial in the 21st century. Solar, wind, hydroelectric, and geothermal power offer sustainable alternatives to fossil fuels, aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Advancements in solar panel efficiency and wind turbine design have made these energy sources increasingly cost-effective and accessible worldwide. Governments and private companies are investing heavily in clean energy infrastructure. Renewable energy not only addresses environmental issues but also promises economic growth through new industries and jobs. However, challenges remain, including energy storage, grid integration, and transitioning from established fossil fuel systems. The shift to renewables represents a pivotal moment in human history, balancing technological innovation with environmental stewardship for future generations. Artificial intelligence and automation. Artificial intelligence, AI, and automation have rapidly advanced in recent decades, transforming industries and daily life. AI systems can process vast amounts of data, recognize patterns, and perform tasks once thought to require human intelligence. From manufacturing robots and self-driving cars to virtual assistants and personalized recommendations, AI is reshaping how we work, communicate, and entertain ourselves. While these technologies improve efficiency and open new possibilities, they also raise important ethical and economic questions, such as job displacement and decision-making transparency. As AI continues to evolve, society faces the challenge of integrating it responsibly, ensuring benefits are shared broadly while addressing potential risks. The future of technology and society. Looking ahead, the future of technology promises exciting advancements that could redefine human experience. Emerging fields like quantum computing, biotechnology, and space colonization hold vast potential to solve complex problems and expand our horizons. Technological progress offers opportunities to improve health, education, and sustainability, but also presents challenges around ethics, privacy, and social inequality. The key will be balancing innovation with responsibility, ensuring technologies serve humanity's best interests while mitigating risks. As society navigates this evolving landscape, collaboration across disciplines and cultures will be vital to shape a future that benefits all.